Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. After the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Syria's interim leadership moved to bring all armed groups under a single command. That included a deal signed last March with the YPG. The Syrian branch of the PKK terrorist organization was to integrate its fighters into the national army. But instead of disbanding, the YPG stalled, missed deadlines, and launched attacks on Syrian forces. The latest clashes erupted in Aleppo, forcing tens of thousands to flee. After reaching a ceasefire with the terror group on Friday, Syrian army units have now retaken key districts in central Aleppo. Interior ministry teams say they're dismantling explosives left behind and clearing streets so civilians can return. In Ankara, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan voiced support for Damascus's campaign against the YPG and offered assistance to stabilize northern Syria. The United States, which has armed and trained the YPG for years, welcomed the temporary truce. So the question that remains is, can a post-Assad Syria unite its forces and end the YPG's hold on parts of the country, or is this the start of another war? For more, joining me now from Toronto is Jamal Mansour, a Syria analyst and lecturer at the University of Toronto. From Ankara, former Turkish diplomat Gülru Gezer, and from Washington, D.C., Rich Outzen, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining me. After a period of calm, it looks like Syria has become active once again. Clashes between the government and the YPG in Aleppo. Jamal, I want to start with you. Right now, where are we between the YPG and the government? Are we somewhere where a deal could be reached, or are both sides farther apart than they were back in March?
Thank you for hosting me, Yusuf Bey. And I was just about to try and break that by saying, I think we're closer than we ever were in the past few months at some type of deal between the two sides. Not because the eyes of the YPG have been open to some kind of new facts. It's, I think, been brewing for the past few months. The stall in the deal had been, I think, brought on by two factors. The first factor is that the YPG is trying, it's like any kind of strategic player, knowing that the time is up. It's the 11th hour. The project that it had been heralding for an independent enclave is out. It's been out since they signed the March 10th agreement. I think what they're trying to do is maximize their yield with the little playing cards that they have right now, in the fear of losing them, especially that the United States had made it really abundantly clear that the gateway to a solution in Syria is through Damascus. That means through the central government. That means no independent enclave. I think YPG realizes that. The problem is that the YPG is not of one mind. There are factions within it. Now, the faction that was lodged in the northern two Aleppo neighborhoods of Ashrafiyah and Sheikh Maqsoud is called Asayesh, and the Asayesh are the more dogmatic, pro-independence Kurdish faction of the Kurdish parties that make up YPG. That is the reason why this is the area where the Turkish and the Syrian government side had decided always to make a focus. That what happens in Aleppo is going to be the model in case the negotiations don't go further, that we will have to resort to force. Hakan Fidan said that a few days before the end of the year, that we understand, we can see, we can call the bluff that YPG is doing. It's using time to stall and maybe get better strategic positioning. But the time is up. The parties have no more patience, and we do not want to go into a direction of a military solution. Mm-hmm. So once YPG basically stalled again, because it cannot control these factions that are more dogmatic, that are represented heavily on the ground in Aleppo, the Syrian and Turkish sides basically cooperated in terms of intelligence, etc. But the Syrian side really went in and made it clear that there is no stalling after this point. I think the people in the YPG command realize that, number one, and number two, can utilize this right now to start basically putting their own house in order and going forth with the implementation of the March 10th agreement. So I'm in my view, I'm thinking there is no vested interest on the YPG side to go on, not because again of some kindness or some kind of moment of aha. It's just the realization that the independent enclave has been out for some while, and that this is now the time to go for gold.
Gudru, it looks like the Turks are obviously very closely following what's going on in Aleppo, also what's going on in northeastern Syria as well. Now, the defense minister, he's also sent messages to the Syrian government saying if there needs to be assistance, the Turks are ready to help out. What would have to happen for the Turks to cross the border again after a couple of years of being on the Turkish side? And also the way the events transpired with the YPG withdrawing from Aleppo, how is Ankara reading that?
Well, Yusuf, Turkey and Ankara has been giving this message for nearly a year, since March 10. And they've been expecting the YPG to comply with the terms of the agreement. But I think that what the YPG is trying to do is to draw Turkey into this conflict. And Turkey obviously sees this. They see this intention, because we can't read what's going on the ground in Syria independently from what's going on in Turkey and Iraq within the framework of the terror-free Turkey process and the terror-free region process. So as our esteemed colleague just mentioned, that there were internal disagreements and different factions within the YPG. We see that there are other elements, other countries that are trying to somehow hamper the terror-free Turkey and the terror-free region process and draw Turkey into this conflict. So as you've said, Turkey has been following the developments very closely, but when will or if will Turkey intervene? I think Turkey is giving the Damascus government a chance, because there were two signatories to the March 10 agreement. One side was the YPG, the SDF, and the other side was the Central Authority. So it's up to the Central Authority to take the necessary steps if the other signatory party does not comply with the agreement. And I think the statement of the Ministry of National Defense made it very clear that, Turkey was not a part of the conflicts going on in Aleppo, but was ready when and if the central government had the need to intervene. So I think the Turkish government, Turkey, will give the central government a chance to somehow comply with the agreement. And I agree to enforce the agreement. And I agree with our esteemed panelists that, we are more closer to the deal than we were ever before, because I think that this was also a test, to test the reaction of Israel, to test the reaction of the United States, to see what kind of statements came out of northern Iraq. And we saw that they didn't get the backing that they actually wanted, because I'll leave it to Rich to obviously talk about the U.S. perspective, but I don't think that the U.S. wants another conflict in the region.
I agree with you on that. I want to get Rich's take. I mean, it looks like Trump has very little patience for conflict right now. He wants to see Syria rebuilding. I mean, the relationship between the YPG and the U.S. government, an Obama-era decision. It seems that Trump has chosen his own partner now in Syria, which is the al-Bashar administration, and a relatively mute reaction by the U.S. Is the reason for that because this clash happened west of the Euphrates and the U.S. views east of the Euphrates more as an area under its influence, or is this now new U.S. policy that they're leaving the decision-making to Damascus and they want to see the YPG integrate?
Well, good to be with Yusuf and also with my fellow panelists here. I do think that the policy has been very clear, if somewhat understated, that the United States is pressing for consolidation of power by the Sharak government in order to complete both the stabilization of the country and the end of the armed conflict. Trump sees himself as a peacemaker and wants those peace deals to stick. And also because he's a businessman, right? And so for Trump, the peace comes through prosperity. He wants, and there's a huge appetite for American investment in Syria, but not just American, Turkish, Gulf, and others. So both as a businessman and as a peacemaker, I think he is growing a little impatient with this. And he, as you'll remember from his first term, does not share the ideological predilection for the YPG or the feeling like those were our guys. And I mean, look, as a military man, I understand why our military folks who fought with the SDF against ISIS do not want to see them end up with nothing like they had under Assad at the end of this. But I think even those people who want to see a good outcome for the Kurds of Syria writ large, and for these Kurds who largely Kurdish groups who work with us, they realize that it's not going to come through fighting the central government in Damascus. Now, I do want to both agree and disagree with my fellow panelists here about things being closer than they ever were. Just in the last 2 hours, there's evidence coming out. Well, there's the military in Syria has declared a new military exclusion zone near Der Hefer on the west side of the Euphrates. Again, so that it is still west of the Euphrates, as you say, but apparently the fact that YPG groups and related groups have been turning off the water going into Aleppo and holding infrastructure and other assets on the west of the river, and in some cases reportedly attacking out of those positions, has led to sort of a new round of tension. So it might get worse before it gets better. And these factionalism needs to take into account not just the distinctions between Asayish and the other YPG leadership, which Kemal has made rightfully. However, there's also the Kandil factor. And there are reports that the Syrian portions, the Syrian Kurds within the YPG, very much want to establish a modus vivendi and get along with the new government and find what the right equilibrium is in terms of sort of their movement's interests. But Kandil wants to hold on to this because they're involved in a broader negotiating process that does involve the situations in Iraq and Turkey. So if you've got this external power who really doesn't want to make concessions, and you've got a local group who's willing to make concessions to get to peace, there's still some road to travel before we get to a stable deal.
Mm-hmm. Jamal, I want to ask you about the fighting prowess of the YPG, because, I mean, when you look at the areas of Aleppo versus areas in northeast Syria like Raqqa or Deir ez-Zor, the Kurdish population in Aleppo is probably a little greater ratio-wise in the favor of the YPG, having more local support, but it seemed like they folded really quickly. Now, when we're looking at areas like Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, where there's an overwhelming Arab population, I mean, that doesn't seem like it bodes well. And I also want to ask you about the YPG being put on the bus and being sent back. I thought that was interesting. Was that a show of goodwill? What was that? I mean, why were they not arrested? Why wasn't any type of consequences being placed on the YPG?
Okay, so I want to also just piggyback of what both Rich and Gulruhanim were saying. I think we are what Rich was basically laying out for us is that when we're saying that it's closer, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen tomorrow. And the signs that there are some military skirmishes, some existing pressure west of the Euphrates, Der Hafer, as he mentioned. This is part and parcel of the boxing in of YPG into a situation where it's fight or flight. You have to take a decision here. As Gudruhanim was pointing out, as you had pointed out as well, that we are now looking at a regional picture where there are no backers that back the YPG's continued intransigence in front of the Damascus government. I think Ankara is front and center here. It does not have an involvement as in on the ground day-to-day operations. Yes, this is left to the Syrian government, but it is very much involved because this is a national security issue here. YPG is now having to take a decision whether to leap into the 10th of March agreement, all in all, and then go and become part and parcel of the Syrian armed forces as the agreement had stipulated, as the latest news that came out of the negotiations were that there are going to be three, types of large battalions that are going to join the Syrian army. All these news about how, the hows of the agreement, not the ifs, are going to have to be implemented right now, and the sooner the better, rather than continue dragging your feet, because neither the Iraqi Kurdistan nor the the Israelis are going to look favorably on it anymore after having been in agreement with the Syrian government in Paris. I think Hakan Fidan's presence in Paris was a message, a very emphatic message. This has happened with us knowing what's going to happen. This is us giving our blessing to this agreement between the Syrian government and Israel. And then that is a message to the YPG that the jig is up. You have absolutely no more backers here. Now, in terms of the forces that were in the exclave in Aleppo, exclave to the YPG heavy area that was overlooking the scene in Aleppo, in the east of the Euphrates. These were not heavily armed forces. These were the police forces of the YPG that were supposed to, in the April 1st agreement with the Syrian government, join the Syrian police. Now, the stalling and the foot dragging meant that they were now policing forces with some heavy arms underhand, but not the full force of the YPG that was ensconced in Aleppo prior to 2024. Now, these forces were left with no alternative but to fold. And I think that this was clear by the lack of active kinetic resistance that we thought that the YPG was capable of, and dragging their feet. So the YPG took out these forces not because they're also sending a peaceful message or anything. It's because it was a lost battle militarily anyways. It was always a political kind of statement to keep these forces in place in order to improve their negotiating situation with the Syrian government. And the Syrian government, backed by all the international community and Turkey front and center politically, was saying this is no longer tenable for you.
Okay. Yura, I want to ask you a little about the negotiations between the Turkish government and the PKK in the second half of last year, which culminated in them disarming, disbanding. How important was that set of talks and the result that came out of it with regards to the YPG in Syria? Are the YPG more isolated right now without the PKK having a presence in Turkey? Is this allowing the Turks to concentrate more on what's happening in Syria? And also, PJAK in Iran, it seems like they've become a little more active with the instability of the protests. Do you think that that could be a factor as well going forward?
Well, Yusuf, Turkey's expectation was very clear from the onset. It expected the PKK with all of its different branches to disarm and disband. And this obviously included the YPG, but somehow it fell on deaf ears in Syria. They didn't take all the messages coming from Turkey as well as İmralı seriously. They said, no, it doesn't include us. İmralı didn't mention us. And we came to this stage. Now, my concern from the very beginning was that, okay, the terror-free Turkey process was going as planned. Although I want to emphasize that the disarm and disbanding lasts years when we consider other terrorist organizations around the world. So we didn't expect this process to end in a year or 2 years. But there was a goodwill and good faith put forward from the Turkish side, from the Turkish government, and it's not an easy thing to do, considering that more than 40,000 people died in this conflict. We saw that in the north of Iraq, there were some symbolic gestures, laying down the weapons and some burning the weapons, and then retreating to Kandil and other centers. But of course, I don't know exactly what is now going on the ground, but according to the information that we received, the terrorists were grouping in the northeast of Syria. So we knew that the weakest link in this terror-free region process would be Syria, because um, certain countries in the region backed the terrorist organization, continue to back the YPG. And the US government, for several months, did not really make clear its intentions vis-a-vis its policy towards Syria. So we didn't know whether if they were really supporting Shara. Yes, we saw there were certain like lifting of the certain sanctions and so on and so forth. But at the same time, they continued to support the YPG. So there wasn't a clarity until very recently with what happened in, I think, Aleppo. So with regards to the process in Turkey, and when we consider the statements even made today by the coalition parties, that Turkey will not let what's going on in Syria disrupt the process. But I do want to emphasize once again that it is not an easy process and it will take time. But Turkey's expectation is for all of the branches of the PKK to lay down their weapons. And obviously that includes the YPG.
Rich, I want to ask you about the meeting in Paris between Syrian officials, the Americans, and also the Israelis. Probably one of the first times the Syrians and the Israelis are getting together at a high level. What do you think the major trickle-down impact of that meeting is going to be for Syria going forward?
Well, I think it was best summed up by one of the major dailies in Israel that called it baby steps towards détente. And I think that's what we're saying. The Netanyahu doctrine, such as it is, I don't think it's been called that, is since October 7th, one of preemption throughout the region. And that clashes, if not directly, then substantially with Trump's attempts to stabilize the region and play the peacemaker role and the economic catalyst role. But at the end of the day, Trump's bona fides as a supporter of Israel can't really be questioned. He's gone to the hilt in terms of military support, and that gives him a little bit of a veto, if you will, on how that Netanyahu doctrine is applied in Syria. And this is very important. It's one of the centerpieces of Trump foreign policy. So I think what we saw in Paris is Trump saying, look, there are limits to your freedom of latitude, your latitude and freedom of maneuver. And now you need to sit down and have a real talk, not about red lines and threats, but about how a process can unfold. One of the things that was discussed, for instance, was in a third country, presumably Jordan, that there would be a technical coordination center where representatives from the Syrian government and Israeli government can talk about security problems and threats and so forth, sort of a deconfliction zone. And this is incredibly important. We have to remember that the Israelis were even when the Iranians were near the Golan Heights and we had Russians all over southern Israel, they were able to have sort of a modus vivendi. They would occasionally strike, but they were talking through indirect means, certainly with the Russians and to an extent the Assad regime. So the theory that somehow Shara is worse than Assad doesn't hold water. Nobody in the international community believes it. And I think Israel over time is coming to a more pragmatic stance with regards to Shara. And frankly, Shara has played his cards pretty well in this regard. And with the military balance being so much in Israel's favor, that's really the only thing he could do. I have been very pleasantly surprised and encouraged by the steadfastness of U.S. policy on this. And as you know, Yusuf, I frequently am a critic of both how we come to policies and how we implement policies. But this one's been pretty steady. It's been unambiguous. We will not let Syria slip back into what it was since 2011 and 2012, which is a failed state. And Shara will not be a second Assad, and we're not going to let the country break into small pieces. This is a very encouraging and very responsible act of statecraft on the part of the United States. And it's really good to see that not just with Tom Barrack, who's dual-hatted as our ambassador in Turkey and our special envoy for Syria, but also throughout the bureaucracy and committing some of the senior diplomats and working through, frankly, some real concerns in Washington, because it's not just about Israel. Even in Washington, as you know, there are some real doubts in some corners about the new government in Damascus and about Shara in particular. So Trump has expended significant political capital to keep all those forces in line, both in Israel and in Washington, and move forward with this very stability-focused policy. So I'm a fan of that, and let's just hope it continues past the midterms in November.
Well, definitely a lot of optimism on the panel. Let's hope that we are in the final stretch of Syria unifying once and for all. Jamal, Guru, Rich, I want to thank three of you for joining me and sharing your insight. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.